How to achieve God complex in the comfort of your own kitchen and outside of it. Welcome. The jazz of psychology brings you a dose of psychology and everyday life mixed with a twist in significance of oneself. The signs and tells of a weak mindset. Self-centrism. Egocentric is a word that many, probably, have heard at least once in their lives. Child development psychology uses the term egocentrism to explain how a small child perceives the world. The stage usually lasts between the ages of 2 and 7. It revolves around the child's perspective, without being able to understand a different person's perspective. Hence why it's referred to as egocentrism. The egocentric view of the world heavily revolves around a child being unable to understand different perspectives. In other words, the child is lacking the understanding of the world, because the child's mind is not yet at the right level of emotional maturity to be able to understand it. During this period of development, the child perceives the world only through their eyes and experiences. At this stage, they feel like they are the center of the universe, because their needs are above everything else, even if the child is not able to consciously understand it. Which is understandable, when it's a child we're speaking of. That is why a small child will kick or punch a table after bumping into it. As far as the child is concerned, if the contact with the table hurts them, then they must hurt the table back, to make it even. The child is not able to comprehend that the table didn't really do anything. The table simply was there. In reality, it was the child themselves who ran into it. Seems silly, right? But that's how it works. When adults grow up to be egocentric, they can feel more significant when compared to others. This happens when a person's mental development becomes impaired, for whatever the reasons, thus causing the egocentric stage to latch on to the mind and make its way into adulthood. The problem with immaturity is that people tend to exaggerate their own significance in their own lives and the lives of other people. Meaning that there is no problem that is more important than their problem, and their troubles are the worst, and well, it's an endless list, truly. At times, these people can also be referred to as narcissistic. True, but that's only part of the story. When the perception of the world becomes warped, problems follow suit. People complain almost about everything, become jealous, dramatic, at times even aggressive and violent, tend to overthink and overreact. These signs will be discussed in separate posts, because all of them are related to one another and closely intertwined. But the point remains, all of it stems from overestimating one's value. Ever hear this one before? They think they are God's gift to earth. Or they think themselves as God. Well, right, a worthy mention. Gods are not the same as special snowflakes and victims. We'll get to those eventually as well, just not now. And before anyone says anything, this is not the same as visualization. Also, self-centered and selfish are not entirely the same, although very much alike. More detail on that another time too. Lack of self-awareness is saved for another post as well, to be covered in more detail. This detail is important to mention, as it is closely related to the topic at hand, however, it is slightly different. Fret not, all will be revealed in due time. Now then, when a person thinks of themselves as God, they tend to believe to be correct on a lot of things, usually without any objective grounds. Mostly because they say, think so, ergo, they know so. Ever hear this one before? My house, my rules? Probably spoken by a parent to a child? Well, sure, it does hold some truth to it. There are certain norms within a society that people should strive to adhere to. But what does it really mean, my house, my rules? It means that within a certain perimeter this person holds the most power and authority. Why? Probably because they are the ones paying for it all. Which gives them the biggest right to be dictating those rules. It's all understandable and acceptable, as long as nobody gets hurt. But let's not dread on that at the moment. The point of this post is, what happens when the boundary between a certain perimeter becomes blurred and the entire outside world becomes someone's playground? A real-life case study will explain more in a second.
When the significance of oneself becomes too much. This is a real-life example of when a weak mindset forgets the place and time and begins to dictate their personal beliefs in a workplace environment. The subject, a senior-age judge in a town with a population of less than 6,000 people. Now, a judge by itself is a rather respectable profession, even more so in a small-time town where everyone knows everyone. A judge can even be equaled to a god in such a small-time setting, which appears to be exactly the case. By definition, a judge is supposed to remain impartial during the proceedings of a case. But what happens when a small-time judge thinks of themselves as above the rules? Trouble is what happens. Why? Because the environment allows it to be so. Now, it is one thing when a person thinks too highly of themselves, but somehow manages to keep it under wraps, especially in a workplace setting. But it is a completely different story when they begin to dictate their own rules and nobody dares to correct the person. It's rather difficult to say something to a judge, right? Exactly why and how the person grew out of bounds with their respectable profession and began treating the courtroom as their private sandbox. As a result, the judge becomes rather heavily involved in the hearings of the case, to the point of arguing with eyewitnesses and/or the lawyers. Not to mention lecturing other officers of the law on how they are supposed to do their jobs, according to the judge's personal beliefs and understanding. Such behavior ensues prolonged hours in the courtroom for everyone involved, disrupting the workflow for many, as well as openly disrespecting the entire legal system. Not something a representative of a respectable profession should be doing, is it? Sadly, this is a real-life situation. Of course, there are worse things like corruption and blackmail, but what the case study talks about is something in a less organized crime setting. The example shows what happens when a weak mindset is allowed to roam about unchecked. What are the reasons that led to such behavior is a different matter. However, the point remains, some problems could have been avoided if somebody spoke up or talked to the person directly. There are certain rules and norms within a society that must be upheld at all times. Unfortunately, at times, it happens so that in an environment in which the weak mindsets outweigh the strong mindsets, it becomes rather easy for a godlike mindset to thrive, because people are simply afraid to become involved and not to cause more trouble. The age of the god plays a crucial role as well. Mostly because senior citizens are close to retirement, so all the workplace has to do is wait it out. Unfortunately, that does not solve the problem, because the damage has already been done. The usual idea is that older people are prone to dramatics due to their age. Sad to say that age does not truly influence this, but perception, how people see themselves and others, do. Not convinced. Ever hear someone say about a young person, they are so full of themselves? It's the same thing, only a different excuse. The difference is the perception, young versus old. In reality, there is no young versus old, it's simply someone who thinks too highly of themselves, regardless of their age. Thus, with no challenger in sight, the god prevails, continuing to cause inconveniences for their colleagues at work, and without even realizing it, because by now it has become the norm for the god and for those around them. You have reached the end of the case study.
Welcome back. It is quite easy to become God when nobody is around, like in the comfort of your own kitchen. But it's also easy to think of being godlike when people around the god don't dare to set them straight. It's one thing to overestimate oneself, but it's a completely different story when the environment around the person lets it happen. It is because of that distorted feeling of significance that the weak mindset becomes self-centered. People afflicted by it fail to notice the world around them and what they are doing, as they proceed to dictate their rules to everyone. That is when we have misunderstandings at work, arguments in relationships and problems within the family, or disagreements with friends and alike. On the other hand, a strong mindset adequately evaluates and understands their value in the world and is able to perform in it accordingly, without giving way to needless conflicts. It does not mean that people with a strong mindset go through life keeping their head down. They simply know how to pick a time and place for things. The biggest problem with self-centered mindset is that, because it becomes too absorbed into its own truth, reality of things, that it becomes unable to listen. So even when someone from the god's surroundings tries to talk to them about their behavior, they don't pay any attention to it, because they do not believe them to be at fault. How can a god be wrong? Well, here's the thing. It all comes down to how the sore subject is approached. Psychology here plays a major role. Now, one somewhat of a popularish way to deal with problems is to call for an intervention. That is when people try to talk to a person about their problems. Usually it's something about bad habits. But it can also work when discussing a person's behavior. Like in the current example. If we go by the more the better logic, then an intervention might be the way to grab the person's attention. If we base the God complex on being a consequence of a weak mindset, then the more people become involved in the intervention, the more chances that the God will hear their concerns. Another way to be heard would, probably, take more effort and time. But if we know how the God thinks, we can model the conversation accordingly, utilizing the right words and methods to get our point across, without upsetting the person or involving an entire crowd. With any luck, the God will hear our prayers. Isn't that why most of us never say anything to anyone? Because we're not sure how to say it? Because we don't want to hurt their feelings? But what if their actions are hurting us instead? What then? You have reached the end of this post. Thanks for listening, stay tuned for more, and always remember, mental health is important too. Take care.